welcome to Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast that explores different aspects and areas of arts and cultural production. I'm Paula Blair, and I'm really delighted this time to be joined by artist Laurel J Carpenter, who talks very generously about her practice. Many thanks to members at patreon.com/avcultures and your continued and much appreciated support. Please do listen to the end to find out more ways to be part of Audiovisual Cultures. For now, enjoy the discussion with Laurel. So Laurel, hello.
Hello.
Would you be okay with introducing yourself for
Certainly.
folks?
I am Laurel J Carpenter, a U.S. visual art performer currently based in Newcastle in the UK.
We're meeting at what's probably a bit of a strange time for you, is that fair to say?
I think so, yes. More than fair.
Yeah. How much would you like to tell us about where you're at the moment?
Sure. So I came to Newcastle specifically to study with Sandra Johnson, who is my PhD supervisor here at Northumbria University. And I submitted the thesis January 3rd, which was its own funny time, right after the holidays, and trying to manage those personal time scales with this overwhelming time scale of submission. And now I'm awaiting my Viva, which is coming up later in the month. So I thought I'd feel more free. I really expected kind of post-submission. I had visions of traveling. I haven't been enough to Scotland. I haven't been to all the local medieval towns that I was really looking forward to getting to. I haven't even been to Durham.
Oh, really?
Can you believe that?
Down the road.
I know. So I was expecting to catch up with all of that. And I found just time has a different consistency than I expected. And it's really funny because, of course, as an embodied practitioner who's interested in theories of embodiment, it was in me, of course. So I was having this other experience of, oh, I'm really shifted. In fact, the funny story is I was like all revved up. So I went to the woman who I buy bread from, who I know pretty well from all this weekly relationship. And I could feel her eyes widening as she kind of recoiled from my insistent kind of conversation. And I recognized it, and I kind of shifted and wrapped up the conversation and took my bread and went. And then the next week when I saw her, I said, yo, was I like acting weird with you? And she said, yeah. So I loved that honesty. She's like, yeah. And I saw the moment that you realized it and tried to kind of rectify it. So there is some different energy that I feel and I'm also churning with.
Having been through it, there is a slight madness, I think, to it.
I felt a little mad, yeah. And I just felt, I expected to just feel like, the kind of cascade of relief. And I didn't.
No, I felt like I'd given my child away.
Oh, that I was happy to give my child away. I felt very comfortable with the babysitter or whomever. I have the additional layer of, so getting ready for the Viva, I'm also performing for the Viva.
Yes.
So it's over 2 days, which the graduate school thought was unusual and tried to negotiate away from. But I convinced them, and it's appropriate, it's a 3-hour outdoor performance. I don't think I could have managed both in one day. And it's one afternoon into the next morning. But, for me also, then it sets the visa end date, which is a moving target. And if I'm not in school full-time or don't have a full-time job, I can't stay. So the completion doesn't just come with a sense of relief. It comes with a sense of unknown and anxiety and the question mark of the future. So I'm trying to manage all that, but it definitely hangs in the air.
Some of those issues might crop up again as we chat through some of your work.
Sure.
So I suppose then we can start in the present and then see where that takes us.
Okay.
And maybe think about what you're working on. So you've been doing a practice-based PhD.
That's right.
Which is a very different experience from doing a theory-based PhD. And it's really fascinating to hear that there's a performance part of your Viva. I mean, the Viva is a performance in a way, which we don't really think about.
Sure.
You have to be a specific version of yourself.
That's right.
You have to find it somewhere because you might not feel that that's who you are. It's quite terrifying. But so the performative element, I mean, you're planning that at the moment, so we don't need to get too much into that unless you want to. Maybe we could think about some of the performative work that has been integral to your PhD, and hopefully that'll open out to your work more generally.
It is easy for me to think kind of backwards chronologically because the piece I'm performing for the Viva has been performed before. So already that's a little unusual. I usually don't repeat. Sometimes I construct performances that are meant to be iterative, so those feel incomplete until it's happened several times. But this piece, so part of what I did in the PhD is explore the content of the research through these opportunities I had to redo work. And I used it as just an experiment. So this piece, which is called Lineage, which is made in collaboration with my long-term collaborator, who is a Norwegian artist, Teresa Longva, and our collaborative duo is called Longva and Carpenter. We've been performing together for 10 years. We made this piece for the Prague Quadrennial last summer. So it's an outdoor piece. The overview of my research, just to summarize, my title of my thesis is This Is She, and it's an exploration of this really specific slippage of selfness that I experience sometimes, but not even often, definitely not all the time, in my own performance work. That was really different than what I had been reading about with dominant theories of character, presence, and persona. So it wasn't quite any of those in literary theory and theatrical theory, and it definitely didn't exist so much in visual art theory, which is the lineage I follow. So I spent the time exploring with the work and really finding with the work and with the writing what those three outcomes or techniques, and they're linked to a scale of connection that goes from micro to meso to macro personal. And I was testing through the work and finding it. But then this piece, which was the most recently presented, we did it only a couple of months before my submission due date, so it was a lot, a whole brand new work to contextualize and get into the content of the thesis. So I'm glad to do it again, to see it again. But here's the segue. It tries to incorporate intentionally from the three aspects of this scale. The way that I'm thinking about it is the micro is about presence, it's about a funneling or flow of focus, so it's about immersiveness. There is something in the way that we engage a very slow snail pace walk. It's 30 meters that we get to in terms of the distance, and when we first did it in Prague, it took 5 hours. And we're each only going half the distance because we start together in the middle. So in 5 hours, we walked 15 meters without stopping. So it's a very slow engagement, so that really creates this immersive experience. Then it's durational, so it has a certain kind of intimacy, and that's within just kind of being in it for that long and connecting with whomever might come across, and the kind of long-term collaborative intimacy. Sometimes Longva and I don't try to reach towards the public in direct kind of intimate connection, which is just eye contact. So I use that a lot. I like that connection, that unspoken bond. She uses that less. So part of hitting all three parts of my investigation was to see if we could really incorporate that. And then it has this big, beautiful, 30 meters of a shared dress in glistening saffron. It is sparkly, rich orange. And then we walk slowly, and then the dress extends and it's so it's almost like a train. It's beautiful in the sparkling sunlight, and it's very noticeable. And when we hit our endpoints, the train becomes taut and becomes a banner, which is certainly representative of a protest banner and was certainly related to feminist content and the Me Too movement. And there's text on the train that's poetic and political both. I definitely also investigate the spectacle and how that functions in performance and what that offers in terms of maybe a character, and in that exceeding the norms is also a resistance. So how can spectacle be reclaimed to still be a way to resist?
And there's something really fascinating going on with a simultaneous separation and connection.
For sure.
Yeah.
That is our work in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Like all we do is look for ways that we long to communicate but can't connect. That's been the 10 years of our work. And it's interesting, when we first met, she was actually my student at Alfred University. She was a little bit older, she had done other degrees, but she came over specifically for the glass department at Alfred, which is widely recognized, and I'm not a part of, so I can say that. There's a strong atelier tradition at Alfred, but she came over for the glass and really found her way to electronic arts, and she was doing performance video work. And so I worked with her on her honors project, which she won all the big awards from her own efforts. I was just lucky to kind of witness it. But then it was some time after that she went back to her very remote Norwegian island. And where Alfred University is also very remote and isolated. It's super rural. It's supposedly 6 hours from New York City, but really takes 8 hours, however you try to get there. And it's the poorest county of all of New York State. Hospitals are closing, right? So it's a very specific locale, which is very similar to where she was. And someone that knew us both well, in a kind of more friendly capacity, said, you two are having the same experience, like two women artists in your remote locations, trying to make sense of where you are. You should talk more. And it was from that was the kernel of like, oh, we should talk more. And almost immediately we were really committed. We came up with Laurel J Carpenter, and I'm good with all the promotional stuff. I used to be a PR director for an art space, so I was like, let's make a website. And it was really fast that we developed our first 3 pieces, which we developed in tandem, called the Needs Trilogy: Hunger, Thirst, and Shelter. So those we kind of devised along in the same thinking process, pretty much at the same point right off the bat, although it took us a few years to get them all presented. And the rest is history, as they say. We've been sticking it out. It was interesting now to reflect on wow, we were just so sure right away. And neither of us had really collaborated before. I definitely hadn't.
Right, okay.
So we actually met my very close friend also from Alfred University, Michele Luminato, is a well-known social practitioner, and she uses collaboration a lot in her teaching and in her own artwork. Teresa and I sat with her and said, how do we collaborate? How do we start? And she gave us some pointers, and then we started Skyping, and it's grown from there.
So it was quite intuitive then, you think? There wasn't a lot of...
It's funny, yes, the certainty was certainly intuitive. I don't know why we were so sure. Some of that is, we knew each other, so there was a base level trust there. But our interests have developed and overlap in some places, but the rest of her, we both maintain a solo practice. And Teresa has another collaborator now, another serious collaborator, who's a social scientist. So her solo work is closer to applied philosophy. She is much more invested in philosophical, deep research, and she's a Deleuze follower. She really knows that work well. And she was a philosophy double major or a minor, which is a focus that we have in U.S. education. She was able to be an artist full-time, that was her major focus, but she also carried a philosophy sub-focus. That certainly propels our conversations, but our solo works really don't seem the same at all. They're both performative, but hers can be more installation, which I've really left that behind in my older part of my career.
There's quite a few aspects we could get into. I'm quite keen to ask you about the fabrics and the clothing, if it's okay to talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I call it a sculptural garment.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, because I feel like costume is too loaded with theatrical connotations and carries with it the idea of a character. And there's something about it is the way that the garment cuts through and has conversation with space that comes from my understanding and working sculpturally. I toyed with wearable for a while, but even that, sometimes I use that. But I definitely feel like sculptural garment is because it's both, there's something about that terminology, I haven't really thought through this before, but it's grounded and something about that's maneuverable. Like a garment you can imagine off or on, whereas a wearable is only in one position. And it kind of has its own, I mean, I never show them alone, but it has its own entity. It has its own identity in some ways. It can stand alone. I feel very connected to them as separate from me in a way that's hard to feel in performance work. So it is my making that then I get to step back from and view as a beholder, right? I'm a viewer of that work in a way that I can never be of my performance work. There's something about making it feel complete on its own or whole on its own.
It seems like the size of a lot of the works, because they become very big, very long.
I know. My whole career, I know. They say you find one thing and you say it your whole career. I've done that, yeah.
And it's very fascinating looking at images of a lot of documentation of a lot of your different solo works where other people start to join in.
Yeah, so that was the first really big dress piece, so which was also when I went back to school. In the US, education's a little different, so I had studied my undergrad. I was an English literature student, and I didn't think art was serious, which I put in air quotes. And I wanted to be an attorney. Right. I was serious about, that's how I was going to change the world. I wanted to be on the Supreme Court. Then when I got to undergrad, I took a law class and was so deflated because I realized my way was not through paperwork. I think some people can, but I wasn't going to change the world through paperwork. And I have a terrible memory. So I was never going to be able to remember all that precedent, which is so much, right? You have to know. And I was like, oh no, this is everything I had been planning for my whole life. It's over. But I loved language, and language was easy for me. And I was interested in the play of language, the rhythm, the sound. And those are still the authors that I love the most, the ones that move me with the rhythm, with the cadence and the pacing and the image. And I'm very anti-plot. You can ask any of my friends. They're like, oh, she won't like that. It has too much plot. But I was also always a very strong renderer. I could draw well from young. But I never took art classes, not even really through university. A couple, I dabbled a little. But then I came out and I moved to New York, and I was looking for positions in arts admin. I wanted to work in a gallery, and that's how I found my way to PR. So it was words, it was supporting art. I stayed in Boston, which is where I grew up, or outside of there, for less than a year, but it was through that job search that I stumbled upon experimental artwork. So my very first job out of uni was at Mobius in Boston, which was founded in the 70s by Marilyn Arsom. So, right, I had a very amazing awakening to the language I didn't even know I was looking for. You know, I was an okay renderer and I was an okay actress, but I really wasn't interested in acting. But that's what I did because that was the only choice through high school and university. And I did set design, but there's something too functional and it just didn't click. And then Mobius, of course, everything clicked. And I was like, what? Installation and sound art and performance. So I was PR, I think they called me the publicist there, part-time, my very first job. And then my parents were moving out of the country, and I was like, oh, yikes, I have to figure out what I'm doing. And my brother was in New York City. My university roommate said, I'm going to go to grad school at Columbia University. Come be my roommate. We got an apartment. So I wound up in New York sooner than I would have maybe found my own way there. And then started working at Performance Space 122 as the PR director. And that was my second awakening. From my first kiss at Mobius to my first love at PS 122. Being the PR person is such great education because you have to talk to the artists when the idea is still in its infancy, because everything has to be done really early. You have to get the press interested, months ahead, especially for magazine articles, right? That's a 6-month or 8-month lead. So to get them interested in Karen Finley or Dimanda Galas or whoever's coming, they have to kind of have something to give you. And then I would take those ideas and those fledgling kind of snippets of information that they had and be able to put them together into a press release. And then watch that develop and alter that conversation I was having with the reviewers and the press people, and that public forum it becomes, which I really support. That's the last kind of public discourse in art, right? That reviewer or preview, it's more like preview now, relationship. And then I would watch the performances every night. I loved it. I lived there. It was great. And then that was how I found my way. Like, oh, I think this is my world. I think, like, take these good rendering skills, take this love of pacing and cadence. Okay, language wasn't quite my form, but I knew I had an inclination towards those things. But I had this kind of visual skill, this spatial awareness, and kind of start to put that all together. And it was, again, it's always community, right? Community is everything. So my first friend in New York, Christine Marguerite, kind of a downtown experimental dancer, she was like, you're an artist. Just make this installation for my dance event. And it was all kinds of funky, like broken down, deep, like lower Manhattan, funky spaces, an old mustard factory. I mean, it was the beauty of New York in the early 90s. And the hard parts too, right? I mean, I moved to New York just in the midst of the AIDS crisis, just in the midst of the culture wars. And then I'm trying to do PR for all these artists who are the ones carrying this conversation and this weight on their own practices forward, right? But then there was so much political, amazing work bubbling up through those cracks. And I just felt like, oh my God, I got to see it all. It was great. So I did installations for many years, and then it took a few years, and in the old days, artists submitted our slides to the slide files, right? And you'd hope some curator would go through these huge filing cabinets of slides and these manila folders and hold it up to the light and see something. And a curator did, found me in the slide file, just from my installation work, which was dense and cluttered and found object driven. And because the found objects, I'm sure, had a kind of tacit performer in there, right? Because it was all domestic. I love the domestic and handable. She just was like, you can do a performance. I don't know if she thought I was a performer or just could see that potential, but she's like, oh, do a performance for this opening. And I think that was like 94 or something. So it took a few years to start. And then, I performed installations for many years, which comes from that Mobius tradition for sure. Then it wasn't until graduate school. Should I get back to fabric? I just realized how far away I went far from fabric, but I'm coming back. So when I went to graduate school, here's the segue, which was after I'd been in New York for many years. Post September 11th, I was there for that. I had been in New York for 13 years or something. I thought, okay, I'm ready to have the next challenge. And I was always interested in teaching. And in fact, I had one of my day jobs was at Parsons School of Design. And after I had stopped and I was an administrator, and my friend there had said, I could keep giving you a class, but you have to get your terminal degree if you really want to teach. So it was that impetus. I left. And when I got to my MFA program, it was from New York to rural Connecticut. So it was wide open spaces and a chance to meander. And I had a gorgeous studio. It was in that space that I decided to separate installation from performance and look at them independently, and slowly kind of installation fell and performance stuck it out. And it came from intuition again, the very first dress piece, which was called Red Crust. So it started kind of in 2 points. One was the site. There's a very locally known hill site there where people go on daily walks, and there's been memorial services, and people have become engaged and married. It's very special to the place, in Storrs, Connecticut. I loved it there. So I felt connection to the site. And then I was seeing glimpses, literally like visions, of a woman wearing red walking through foresty fields. And I'd be driving and I'd see glimpses, and I'd be in the studio and I'd catch a glimpse. Those were conflated for me, the site and those images. And because the site was local, I decided that the image had to be built locally. So this is the days before the internet or much internet use. And I was posting up flyers and putting ads in the little local penny saver papers for anyone who wanted to donate a red dress. And here's a drop-off point, or you can mail it to me, or I'll come pick it up from you. Here's my email. I received about 100 red dresses, and those were the dresses that became one impossibly long red dress. So I stitched them complete, bodice to hem, again kind of a train, and it took 9 months, which I thought was interesting in terms of that gestation period, and stitched them all together. And there was, so the community donated, a lot came with very beautiful handwritten notes about the connection that people had to the dress and why they were willing to offer it to me, because they knew they'd never get it back, right? It's stitched permanently into this impossibly long red dress. And some were very moving, and I have them together in a binder of all the letters. It was an elderly woman sent her mother's ball gown from the military ball she went to with her father, the first Christmas infant dress from a mom, and one woman whose daughter had taken her own life, and she was very funky, and she loved Tori Amos, and she had these kind of funky art girl dresses, and that woman wanted to meet with me and say, you remind me of her. She would love this project. I'm so glad she's a part of it. And so then I wore the dress. So a beautiful day near Beltane, near May 1st, which was important to me, the time of the year that it's most fertile. I started behind the hill crest. Viewers came at the valley of the crest and stood, and I could feel the anticipation. The dress unfurled behind me just a little at a time. So as I moved down, a little more revealed, and I came down the crest and a little more revealed. But it was also a fledgling hay crop, so the grass was quite tall and then very resistant, right? It was a lot of friction. So it was really hard work. And I've never measured or weighed the dress. I know it's 100 or approximately 100 dresses, and I don't want to know those specifics and kind of name it and frame it, but it's heavy, right? I mean, altogether if it's in this really big crate and I can't lift it by myself. Right. So it's a big, heavy dress. And in the process of the piece being performed, I had plans as a performer. I had been a performer. I understood about duration and testing the limits. And I definitely don't consider myself an endurance performer. I don't test beyond my limits, and I kind of don't break whatever that boundary is. But I like to go up to the limits as much as I can. But it's usually time-based. Like I'm long and slow, and I can get there. But I'm not like fast and hard, right? I'm long and slow. So I had plans to pile the dress up on top of me and keep going, but I had heard after the fact that a huge controversy broke out in the viewing audience. And I knew a lot of people there, like my parents came up and friends from New York came, people from Boston that I knew came, and then my own supervisors were there, my chiropractor and my uncle, and so it was a lot of people who thought they knew, right? And it was a lot of people who donated dresses. Yeah. What I find is most interesting that comes out of that controversy of whether or not they should come in and help me. Some people were like, she's suffering, we have to go stop that suffering immediately. And both of my supervisors were very serious practicing Buddhists, so they were like, no, the suffering is a big part of it, right? So it wasn't even about the work, it was just about everybody's own perspective. The chiropractor didn't want my back to suffer, whereas the Buddhists were like, through this process is the only way, right? So the work allowed everyone their own space of ownership, which of course comes from the way it was developed, right? Everyone, in fact, was a co-author. Everyone did write those letters. I was carrying that history. It was theirs. But to hear my mother tell the story of everyone trying to own it is very interesting, right? She was like, who are all these people claiming a piece of my daughter and her work? So people were invested. Eventually, 2 people came out and helped lift a part of the dress, and then everybody rushed out to see. So, it changed from this offering, this act I was trying to offer, right? And I think visually, it was this, it was the beautiful hill crest, the beautiful blue sky, all the beautiful dresses. I just wanted to embody that image as an offering. And then it became this parade, which are things that are more known. So I initially was kind of disappointed, just became something comfortable. right? Just as a way for everyone to understand the experience. It's a parade now, and the little kids are there, and everyone's happy, and it's a celebration. But, with time, I thought, but of course, it was theirs. So it could only unfold the way that it did. They needed to be part of it. So who am I to put limits on what the offering is? Like, you have to offer, and then the way that it's accepted, it is the only way, right? So that was an important piece for me because it was the first dress, and then I've come to do many long dress pieces. But it was also my very first experience of what I have come to term the altar self. There's something I remember so clearly, being behind the hill crest and then taking that first step up, and the viewers were down below, and there was something that shifted in me. I mean, it didn't feel like me. It was the self more than. It was all of them. It was a kind of collective identity. It was all of us together. It's funny, it feels even messy to me describing it from back then, whereas I've come now to really define the altar self from these 3 strands. But that one, that really felt like my first memory of experiencing that, like really strongly, really clearly. And it's flickery, right? Because I remember struggling with the dress. The other interesting thing is, one of the reasons I think it seemed most like it was struggling so much was because that very old military gown, it was an old, beautiful vintage dress, which had kind of an underskirt. And, I had stitched everything really well. I mean, I knew it was long and heavy, but that was one of the first ones after me, and I could hear ripping. I was like, oh no, the dress can't rip right at the top, right from close to my body. What will I do? And I had a whole harness and everything, so I thought I was just going to walk forward and let kind of my core glide it forward. But the ripping sound really alerted me. It made me fearful. And so that was where I flickered in and out of, I was this other self. Oh no, I was afraid Laurel, worried I was ruining my own performance. But then it was the power of kind of the viewers and that energy and the power of the dress tugging me backwards. But the ripping sound made me reach back and yank the dress, which was much harder. My arms are not as strong as, my core. So I think it was that I was trying to go between them and my own kind of uncertainty in the events as they were unfolding. I think that's what alerted the viewers first to I wasn't so sure. I was struggling. They had to come. It's theirs too. They had to come help. Whatever my intention was, and all I did was walk down the hill crest, and I was going to disappear into the forest kind of at the horizon. So it wasn't even that I had a purpose, but they were going to come out and support wherever I was going. What was I doing? Who knows? But they were going to come out and alleviate that suffering.
It sounds like they had real emotional investment in every individual piece of clothing as well.
For sure.
It had become one thing. It had become a community.
That's right. Right.
All of these stories and all of these past people, all of these bodies that had occupied these clothes.
That's right.
So people must have felt compelled to go, well, these are precious objects, whereas
that's right.
If it had been just one long train of anonymous fabric, they might not have.
I think that's very right. Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
And that's the power of found object too. That's what I loved about found object when I was making more installation work. It's the history and the patina and the liveliness of that beautiful, curious thing. I mean, as much as I make performance, I still love those things.
I think there's something fascinating about garments that they contain performance. They seem to have ghosts of past performative acts in them because they've been worn and they might be stained from a body that occupied them in some way. For sure. So it's fascinating in that sense as well, as you're carrying more than just a bit of fabric.
That's right.
There's so much more in that.
Yeah. The other garment I think about a lot is one I made out of dozens of white shirt sleeves.
Oh,
so
right.
I say this also with air quotes, men's business shirts.
Okay.
All from the charity shops. And those two, because they've been worn before. So even before I wore it, it had that same energy. I felt that same connection to it. So it wasn't about me who had performed it. It was about that they were however performed and lived. Even though they were deconstructed and reconstructed and it was all kind of funny, it still carried that. And then it's all the people and all the arms and all the things that that suggests in terms of both embrace and contain. And yeah, I like that too. I like the abstracted garment before that, not just, and that's the difference, I think, even though costumes can be abstracted, of course, or somehow altered beyond expectation, there is still something about its functionality. Even if they're meant to constrain or something, they still function towards that constraint. I'm not sure.
Makes me think of reading about your piece in Hexham as well. I think it was where you used red gloves.
I used the red gloves in two pieces, point out and touch on.
But again, that idea of hand rather than body or part of a body occupying. So it's in a specific part of a body where it's the very gestural, expressive part, but a part that's external and yet part of you. And the idea of you touching your face while wearing the gloves and then discarding them, and I feel like there's something there about a gathering of a community of things that had belonged to anonymous other owners. And then the change that they go through when you work with them, you adapt it in some way. It becomes part of something that you're performing, and then the idea of you making it part of your bodily performance, but it's still embodying previous people's. I don't know, there's just something.
The interesting thing about those Hexham pieces is so unlike Red Crest, where no one could reach me. As much as those gloves had the energy, and it was certainly inspired by that same sense of, I was moved by the site, right? So I was interested in the tanneries and the history of Hexham, and that's where gloves first came from, because the curator said, there used to be tanneries. There's a famous old glove in one of the museum exhibitions. And I was like, gloves. And I had used arms, and I had used gloves and kind of arc fist gloves before, so it wasn't unknown to me, but I love that feeling of like, something's going in me now. I love gloves. I'm a very serious vegetarian leaning towards vegan, and I only used leather gloves, so what's that about? It was I was certain of the history. It had to be those old used leather gloves. Still, the ways that I activated them then didn't allow the people to come through. Now, it wasn't the direct people, right? So it wasn't like these are the donors of the dresses, and these were just people who were coming to Hexham Abbey, right? So it was different. Their intentions were different. Like the viewers of Red Crest came to see that performance, whereas the viewers at the Hexham Abbey were coming to see the Abbey, and I happened to be there. There were some specific viewers, but it was a lot of tourists, just people coming to see the site. Maybe we weren't able to bridge, or the material didn't become enough of a bridge for us to meet. But it was also the way that I used the material. So instead of putting the dresses on display, and it was about that offering. I said offering, 4 times, right? It was about that image that everyone could be part of. Whereas the gloves, it was all about hiding my identity or casting them out with the point. As much as the object has power, the performance and the gesture has the power as well. I'm using these big words, power and offering and spectacle and beauty, but I do feel humble in using that terminology. Right? I feel like I'm just privileged to be able to embody these words, these opportunities for whatever short time I get to, right? I don't feel like I'm the origin of those terms, but I do feel fortunate that I get to step into them. And those are the terms that move me, those senses of awe and kind of the big spectacle, extra personal, where I'm just a speck and there's this big other thing happening. Those are the words that move me, unlike, other performances that are subtle and soft and small. I feel like my intent may be that, but it comes across in kind of this visual display, this bigger, splashier. And I like that tension, but I also feel like, right, I don't fit physically. My gestures are big, my hair is big, my body's big, I'm big. So I can't fit in those subtleties visually, even though I think I'm interested in them emotionally or intentionally So I kind of have to do the big word, the big image, that big terminology for it to have space for me. But then I try to find that place of, and all of my work is silent. I mean, sometimes I use sound, but very rarely, never language or never spoken, maybe only once with Laurel J Carpenter. So like I have a quiet intentionality, but still I'm comfortable carrying, I think this is it, I'm comfortable carrying the bigger. And I feel like, I have that capability. Like I can carry that image forward and you all can actually come out and see it. Like all of you, come out and rush out to the dress. I can do it. And I'm interested in those two things. I don't really want to do it. I'm one of the very typical loud introverts. Like I am so introverted. Like I can go days alone in my flat. I never want to see a person, but I'm loud and personable and kind of comfortable, even though I need to be alone. So I feel like that's in my work too, those two things. Kind of alone in the beauty. Yeah, that's the title of my memoir. Alone in the Beauty. Perfect.
I was thinking about, just off the back of all of that, the idea of taking up space, and this is a very feminist notion at the minute, is trying to reclaim space and take up space, because we've been shoved into corners and we have to be as little as possible. So it's really interesting you're talking about bigness and that taking up of space. And so many of your garments, the elements of your performances do take up space
for sure.
A lot.
Yeah.
Even if it's you're discarding things, because not just thinking about the gloves, but I remember your piece in Vain a few years ago where you were dropping the needles.
Yes, that's
as well. So it's really fascinating you mentioned you didn't really use sound, because that was a very, you would call it a silent piece, but if you're quiet enough, you could hear them drop.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. And you definitely were one of the few who listened very closely.
Yes.
You came up right to the edge of those pins to hear with me. That piece was developed to be an exploration of sound, so I think there was no way to avoid some sound. And I shush too, right? So I personally did make vocalization. I mean, I don't never use sound, but usually not. I think that's interesting, that tension with the content of that work. Because I invited people to make sound, right? With the lover's telephone, with the tin can. So I wanted kind of commotion. Otherwise I wouldn't have anything to shush. But I wanted that tension. It's funny, I just redid one of the very few pieces I have ever redone is that piece. Right. I brought it to Oslo, like moments. I think I did that in December, mid-December, and my submission was early January. I mean, it was like I was so crazy. So but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to go. And that whole festival was about sound and silence, how to hear a performance. So I was like, well, it has to be this.
Ideal,
But it was a different floor. It was a very different setting. And I performed it much longer. But the floor was wood, and it didn't quite, and I didn't want all the pins to get lost, so I found this, and I was a lot bigger, so I had to add some gussets to my dress. So I had these kind of black stripes down the side of my white dress, and I found this black glass square, very clean. So that became kind of the target, the landing zone of the pins. And the pins were really loud. I mean, for a pin dropping, right? But so much louder than that other piece. And I thought of you and that.
Really?
I did. And I performed durationally, but no one else did. It was mostly sequential work. So I was up on the balcony of an installed performance through the whole evening. So people were able to come up with the breaks, and the other people were performing down. And I would try to keep the same performance intention, where I was noticing the difference between intentional and involuntary or inadvertent sounds. But it was harder because I kind of knew the waves of, like, now it's a performance, and now all the viewers are going to start chatting because it's a break. The waves were more standardized, but I would perform through the other performances. Durational work, and usually they had sound and noise. It was about a sound, the whole theme was sound. And I remember the very young Finnish artists were performing, and they were jingling bells, and they were making vocalizations, and their piece was really loud, and then it suddenly stopped, and I didn't have a chance to recognize that before the pin, so it was like loud, 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 silence, and then plunk. I mean, you could hear the pin everywhere. And I was like, wow, that moment was my piece.
Yeah.
That was everything. This unexpected hush and plunk. You could really hear that pin.
Wow.
Yeah, I felt bad that they were like, oh no, we didn't notice. But the organizers and a lot of the people that I knew there, they were like, oh my God, your pins are so loud. I was like, that's so funny.
So as well as the sound, I was thinking about even just those extensions of you and your performances
space,
taking up spaces somehow, because I remember the precarity of where's the pin going to land? Is it going to fall on me? Am I too close? Should I get out of the way? But I want to be able to hear them. So
Interesting.
That was just my experience as a viewer and somebody who was being a bit cheeky and getting close to you, because I think there is this barrier often that viewers of live performance will just naturally assume, and they feel like I'm not allowed to encroach on this.
Yeah, that's a very UK phenomenon that I have found. I wasn't expecting the viewers here to really, there's a comfort in the perimeter.
Yeah, they'll stay at the walls.
And I think that's why I really like the eye contact, because I think it gets people, and I've done pieces where you have to hold hands or other things, so it's about, because I'm very comfortable with people coming right up to me.
Okay.
I'm happy for that. I feel like it gives me a purpose. If it's just a show, I'm not as comfortable with that, you know. But it's, again, that's like my terminology that I think many people would argue with. It's about how I embody, right? It's about how I understand. But I like the idea of feminist notion of taking up space, and that's definitely what lineage, I mean, that's part of the subject matter.
Yes.
We are reclaiming our voice and we are taking up space, 30 meters, right? I mean, you have to navigate. I mean, people can get around, and we're careful about that, especially here with risk assessment and awareness, but it takes some consideration, like you have to get around us when we're at that full extension. And even just navigate like what's going on, we're connected, but we're just gradually taking up more space. And then the text on the train that becomes revealed when it's a banner is, here is a silence broken. So it is really about stepping into that.
It's a fascinating conundrum, I think, for viewers as well, is if you have something like that, that is so clearly it's connected and yet it's so long, there's both a connection and a distance from the performers. So there's this question of, are you allowed to touch it? Are you allowed to go up and look at it and be quite tactile with you're looking at it and you're exploring of it? And I'm happy with people doing it, because you sort of think, well, even if the artist isn't happy, well, they're 10 meters away. Right, like, what are they going to do? Are they going to just stop? What can they do? Slow walk? I have to say, I wouldn't even know. I didn't know until I received the photo documentation how much people were reading ahead. We would try to keep the text unrevealed until the end, although of course the wind blows and you can see it coming, and that is purposeful. But people were reading ahead like a storybook, unfurling it and checking it. Everybody had their hands all over it. I had no idea. I could feel the dress moving, but it would also kind of gust like a parachute around us. I mean, it was definitely on the move, and we tried not to look back and control that. We had, and I like this, and that's the quiet, immersive flow. Like, I have one intention as a performer, and that's to walk ahead very slowly. What a luxury. Like, how lucky am I? For 5 hours, for 3 hours, for 8 hours, I got to do one thing. I mean, that's Zen bliss, right? I mean, I feel like all the work that I do in the studio and in the office and all the applications and all the grants and all of it is for those few amazing hours where I get to do one thing and just be in that space. That is everything to me. As the performer, that is everything to me. But I think that, of course, doing that one thing would be different if I wasn't tugging the other thing, you know, if I wasn't carrying that visual, if I wasn't alone in the beauty. It's all about alone in the beauty. But I get to be there, but of course there's all this other world that is emerging because of this. Really, you're taking up time as well as space. For sure. And as you say, it's a luxury, it's a privilege in a way to have the time, to be able to take the time to do that. I don't know if it's maybe a bit connected to the idea of the flaneuse, you know. I don't know what that is. Well, there's the flaneur, this notion of men moving slowly through cities when cities were getting really fast, and then the flaneuse is the feminization of that, of trying to be a woman who can do that as well.
Interesting.
And I suppose it's quite a privileged position to be able to be in.
Yeah.
And you did this in the middle of Prague, wasn't it?
Prague,
Originally,
yeah.
So you can see that you're in the images of it on your website. You know, it's a fairly busy square that you're doing this in.
For sure. Yeah, because it was a big quadrennial.
Yeah.
It was busy.
There's a lot of people around, so, you know, people have to, as you were saying, negotiate with the two of you and the space that your shared garment is taking up.
Yeah.
But there's that idea of the time that you both take to make that movement. A move that could otherwise be done in seconds, but you stretch it out over hours.
That's right. It plays with that purposefulness. Why is it taking so long? What are they doing?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I like that curiosity. When I was younger and stronger, I could push gestures that are a little bit more tougher, right? Although I never did, like I said, I never was an endurance performer. You know, I'm not an athlete. Like, I was never pushing those, and I'm not a dancer. I was never pushing those kind of physical limits. But I was stronger. I could do things differently. And now I feel like, the one thing I have left, the one thing that's just in my bones is I'm slow. I really can be slow, which is much harder for Teresa. She's fast in her body. That piece was harder for her. Because it's for the Viva and because it's March in northern UK, we're shortening it to 3 hours. But it mostly was her going 5 hours for that short distance was just really very physically hard for her, which you wouldn't expect, right? You know, standing is hard, sure, but everybody in retail, everybody who has a job, a workers stand a lot. That's not so tough. And the moving forward, at least you're moving a little bit so your muscles are engaged. But I just think it's the mental over physical, and it's, you know, and it's trying to engage the distance, and it's trying to it's just a lot of holding on, right? You're just trying to hold on through it. So that relates to endurance that way, that gripping. But I feel like that's Teresa, she's doing this, the grip, whereas I feel like I can just, I mean, it's not like super simple and I have to pay attention, but going slow is a relief for me. Like, oof.
I mean, it's fascinating thinking about slowness and the slow movement, and you've written quite a bit about this as well.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in it because I feel like just the world is too fast for us all. And it's...
For sure. Let me tell you, that was a big part of my teaching.
Yeah, sure.
Which, you know, I have to say comes from the Abramovich method. When I went to graduate school and did that first Red Crust piece is when I first met Marina Abramovich. The University of Connecticut, such an unexpected place, gave her an award, some type of fellowship. So she came and she did a workshop with us, just the few of us, when it was a very small program. It was a 2-year master's program, and there were only 4 or 5 of us in each year, and I was the only no, there were other performers at other times, but it wasn't a lot. There was a painter and a video maker and a sculptor and whatever. Very few of us. She saw the documentation and she saw the book of all the Red Crust, and still, like, she gave me one of the biggest compliments I ever had. She said, "You're not like other Americans. You are a true performance artist."
Oh, wow.
I take that with a grain of salt, of course, because I was the PR director of Performance Space 122, but I do know what she was saying, because when I was making work in the 90s in New York, no one even knew I was an artist, because I was making visual art performance in the European tradition, and all of my closest friends and people I greatly admire, Sally May and Jennifer Miller and Holly Hughes and Karen Finley, Tom Murrin, they make performance art, what we call performance art, in New York at the time, and it's text-based. It's definitely text-driven, and people didn't even know I was a performer. I mean, and it took me time to grow into it, but even now people don't know there. Like, the New York scene doesn't know me. Now, that has changed when I left New York and went to grad school and then got the teaching position. Then New York, the Bushwick scene and gray space developed, and that reclaiming of the 70s visual art performance is being engaged there now. So in both ways, I feel like, I just missed the communities. And I didn't fit with the community. That was my time. That was my era. And then I missed the a new community of younger artists. And that is definitely an undercurrent of at least my career, maybe not of my work, but like trying to find the place that I fit. And I think that's interesting in terms of the Laurel J Carpenter work. We are trying to come together, but it's impossible to come together, and it's a struggle to connect. And even though, of course, we recognize all the ways that we're privileged and similar in our privileges, our race, our education, our age, like what, and yet still the differences make it such a challenge to find a mutual space, a space that allows for both of us. And we're certainly invested in that exploration. And then of course we're in it together in terms of building the work, but if some of that wasn't there in our interpersonal relationship, I think it would be hard to get to in the work. Whereas I've had other collaborators that were just like, yeah, we're on board, even though they maybe come from other disciplines. So I work less regularly with a dance practitioner and scholar and a musician and composer. So our works, like Teresa and I, we understand our work and our working methods, like we're both visual artists. Whereas with these other collaborators with other backgrounds and who are differently gendered, like Teresa and I are both women and those other collaborators are both men, but there's something of like we just speak the same language, or we're just able to leap over the differences to come to a togetherness in a different way. Teresa and I are really interested in that tension. And maybe it is because we are so similar that the discrepancies feel huge in that shift of perspective. She and I are working now on a book. It'll be my first publication of our 10 years of our collaboration. So I think we're really thinking about our practice in a new way, and I've been really thinking about our relationship and our practice and our collaboration in a more significant way. So it's still juicy to me, right? It's still like, there's stuff to unearth there. I'm interested in it.
It's a very odd time when you come to the end of a PhD process, and in one sense it ends, and in another sense it never really ends. So it's nice if you have an overlap with something like that, whereas you brought it with you, it came before, and now you're going to continue it on and you're going to mark this 10-year point, but that's not the end of it, it's going to carry on.
That's smart. Yeah, in some ways, because I come to the PhD as such an older person, as a long practitioner, it has been funny, right? Because it does feel more like the PhD was a sojourn. Like I went on this weird trip, and it was an intense trip. It was like suddenly I'm climbing Mount Everest, but it didn't feel like, of course I did move, but it didn't feel like, oh, I moved house and now I have a whole new life. It just felt like I went on a trip. And I hope that trip changes me and maybe it'll propel me to move house. But in terms of where it falls in my career and how much career I've had before, the PhD is short. Even though I felt it. I mean, I certainly felt it. In fact, right, and I did it through menopause. So doing the PhD through menopause made me say, I demand an additional letter. I want an M.PhD. And I was like, and you know what? All the new mothers can also have it. And then I said that to someone and she said, oh no, don't do that because then it'll be devalued. So everyone with an M.PhD will be lesser. And I was like, you know what? That is our world, right? I don't want an M.PhD. Even though, of course, I understand I was engaging through my own stuff in a way that was unique in so many ways, like in the research, in my body, in the place that I lived, in my lifestyle. So that intensity definitely felt like I wasn't on holiday. It was a sojourn. It was a vision quest of some sort. But it doesn't feel like it's life-defining. Maybe it'll shift my career a little, and I think it has. You know, my engagement with research is different. It definitely opened up new ways of theoretical research for me, which I was interested in, but just not to this. I just never was able to get to this depth, you know. But I already feel like my old needs and the demands of my life, job searches, but also just life pace and life structure, I can already feel them coming back now. Like the sojourn is winding up, and I'm buying my tickets home. And I think what I define as home maybe has changed. It's still a different place. It's still a place that I'm heading to that isn't the sojourn place. I don't know. I haven't thought that totally through, but there is something there. But, you know. ask me again in a year, I'm
Yeah,
sure I'll
well,
have a
that's
very
it.
different answer. Yeah.
It's transient, yeah.
Yeah. People do say, I've talked to a lot of artists who are of my generation, including my very close collaborator, the dance artist Robert Bingham, who has come over. He spoke. I developed a symposium, and he was one of the speakers. So he was invested in this process, and I knew him. He was a visiting artist and long-term lecturer, also where I taught. And then he left, and he had more of a visiting contract. He didn't have the tenure track contract like I did. So he always had the trouble with the contracts. But he finally was like, I'm done. I'm going back to he got his PhD. And so that was the first inkling for me, like, oh, I can leave this position and maybe do something else. And he said it took him a year to understand how his brain had changed and the agility of his thinking. He didn't even recognize until a year after he had completed everything. So perhaps I'm still in that space where I can't see.
Yeah, no, it does change you, I think. Psychologically as well as mentally and emotionally. It's a massive thing to do.
Fingers crossed
Absolutely.
for the future.
We're leaving you at a time when you're, as much as anyone, facing uncertainty.
For sure, like so much of the world these days.
Yeah, totally. But feeling, it seems very positive. You've done a really fantastic body of work in the 3 years or so that you've been here, as well as what you've done before. So there's bound to be lots to come.
Fingers crossed. That's all I can do for all of us. Really, that's what I feel like.
Yeah.
You know, like let's all just keep moving into our future, and let's keep bringing our values to the forefront as much as we can. There's a lot to resist.
Yeah.
And let's keep doing it together.
Laurel, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. It was really good practice for me. So
Good.
thank you. Yes,
Excellent.
yes. It's good for me to talk about the
Excellent.
work. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Woohoo!
You've been listening to Audiovisual Cultures with me, Paula Blair, and my very special guest, Laurel J Carpenter. And huge thanks to the Old George Inn in Newcastle for accommodating our interview. This episode was recorded, edited and produced by Paula Blair. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, licensed under Creative Commons Non-Commercial 3.0 license, and is available for download on ccmixter.org. If you like what we're doing, please help meet production and distribution costs with a regular payment to liberapay.com/PEA Blair, or make a one-off donation to paypal.me/PEA Blair. Episodes are released every other Wednesday. Subscribe on your chosen app so you never miss a new release. You can find the full back catalogue on YouTube. Do visit audiovisualcultures.wordpress.com or follow AV Cultures Pod on Instagram and AV Cultures on Twitter and Facebook for more information and useful links. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you next time.